Okay, let's get to our panel. Joining us from Beijing is Qinduo Xu. He is a senior fellow at the Pangoal Institution. With me here in Washington is Yuval Weber. He is a senior fellow at the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute, and he's also associate professor at Daniel Morgan Graduate School. Also with us from London is Alexander Nekrassov. He is a political analyst and former advisor to the Kremlin. And with me in the studio too is Peter Kuznick. He is a professor of history at American University, and he's also the co-author of The Untold History of the United States with Oliver Stone. Welcome to all of you to the show. Qinduo, let me start with you. As we heard in that report there from Jim Spellman, China has responded very strongly to these sanctions that were imposed by the United States. Here's more of what the Foreign Ministry spokesman had to say. He said, "We strongly urge the US side to immediately correct its mistake and withdraw the so-called sanctions. Otherwise, the US side must bear the consequences caused thereafter." So, Qinduo, what is your assessment of these sanctions and, of course, China's response?
Well, I think for China, the argument is the business between China and Russia and the purchase of those weapons. First of all, it was done some years ago in 2014, that based on the agreement. So the delivery of those weapons, some of them, after 2017, late 2017, after the U.S. imposed sanctions on Russia. And secondly, of course, this is normal military purchase from Russia. Russia exported to China. This is not against any international law or international norms. And thirdly, it's only about the U.S. law. U.S. is simply imposing domestic law on other countries, like a secondary sanction, like on China. But there are some 30 countries also purchasing weapons from Russia, including Turkey, India, and Indonesia. So, people would wonder whether the U.S. will also impose sanctions on all those countries. It is very hard to do so. And of course, it is, from a Chinese point of view, it's unfair, and also it is unacceptable.
Yuval, Qinduo raises a good point there. There are many countries that buy weapons from Russia. Is the United States going to take action against all these countries, some of them allies of the United States?
Well, technically speaking, the countries that purchase weapons from Russia are able to get a waiver, basically through the Department of Defense and onto the president himself. And so what's happening in this situation is, and what China is very upset about, is they got caught on what's called the specially designated nationals list. So the sanctions that were placed on the 33 Russians, and as well as like the Russian intelligence agencies, that makes it those who deal with them themselves get sanctions. Right. And so it's that Chinese military unit and its director that basically were buying the fighter jets plus a bit of the missile defense system from Russia. That's what got them in the trouble that they're in.
But Yuval, looking at the action that the United States has taken, how do you explain that? Because it comes at a time when the U.S. is already involved in a growing trade dispute with China.
Sure. So this is, I think, really getting into what is the domestic politics of Washington right now. We have, in a sense, here in Washington, two different Russia policies. One is led by President Trump, and one is basically the rest of the U.S. government. The rest of the U.S. government wants to take a very hard line against Russia, and they want to make sure that potential customers of Russia's arms export agency, Rosoboronexport, the one that actually sold the fighter jets, that those countries think twice about dealing with Russia because things like this may happen to them. And really, this is probably aimed more at Iran than anyone else. And so when it comes to this other issue of trade and tariffs, that's clearly President Trump and almost no one else in the U.S. government. So in a way, what we hear the messaging on sanctions, on trade, and on defense, Trump and the rest of the U.S. government don't seem to be seeing eye to eye. So although it seems that there is an issue linkage, we're not really hearing that messaging from U.S. government officials.
All right, let's go to Alexander Nekrassov. He's in London. Alexander, we've heard some pretty strong reaction from the Russians as well. The Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, referring to the sanctions as, quote, yet another act of unfair competition. What do you make of this action by the U.S.?
Well, I think that at the moment we see chaos in Washington. And Lavrov was actually right, because Americans were always trying to compete with Russia and using underhand methods. That happened for many years, so it's nothing new. But we are seeing a situation when there's a power struggle in Washington. Nobody really knows who decides, the policy on Russia and China. it's easy to say, you know, the president is for this, Congress is against it, the rest of his government is for this. I think it's a very dangerous situation when you have a nuclear superpower like America and you don't really know what's going on in Washington. And of course, in the Kremlin, they understand that until the midterm elections happened in November, they can expect many more very strange decisions coming from Washington, from President Trump, and from his opponents. I think the Chinese side was correct in reminding the Americans that what they're doing is wrong and illegal. But I think they also understand that we can expect anything in the next month and a half until the elections. So let's see what happens in November.
Peter, what do you make of it? And is there some kind of schizophrenia here when it comes to American relations with Russia and with China, that one group in Washington thinks one thing, another group thinks another?
Unfortunately, no. I mean, there's some different policy differences. There's always been policy differences on Russia and China. But we see, especially with Russia, a very strong anti-Russian prejudice right now. It's been going on for several years, 4 years now. Demonization of Russia, demonization of Putin, ever since the developments over Ukraine, the Russian seizure of Crimea, and it was exacerbated by the Russian, quote-unquote, meddling in the U.S. election in 2016. Yeah. There's one main voice, and it's an anti-Russian voice. And as our guest was saying from Moscow,
he's in London.
Yeah. You know, it's a dangerous situation because the United States and Russia and China are militarily antagonistic at this point. And Russia and China have been enhancing their military capabilities. The United States has also been more and more threatening toward them. The United States and Russia, between us, have about 93% of the world's nuclear weapons. We've got these growing confrontations, especially in Ukraine and Crimea, but also in the Baltics. And now with this, this seems like a gratuitous piling on to an already dangerous situation. So I'm very worried. We've got other developments in the South China Sea. There's a lot of potential hotspots that could erupt in something much more violent.
But Peter, what are we to make of the fact that, you know, you have the United States taking action against China to send a message to Russia, which might have an impact on arms sales to Iran? I mean, what are the broad geopolitical implications of this?
The United States is, in some ways, waging a trade war against much of the world right now. The United States is geostrategically taking some positions that are alienating it. For example, the Iran nuclear deal. To abrogate the Iran nuclear deal, to most of the world, that made no sense at all. So on one hand, where in Korea, the United States seems to be tamping down a crisis that Trump himself helped create in the first place, in other places, the United States is ramping up these crises. So I think in the broader global sense, when I look at it, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists moved the hands of the doomsday clock in January of this year to 2 minutes before midnight. That's the closest it's been since the early 1950s, and for good reason. I mean, the world is a much more dangerous place. I don't know that Trump has a broader geopolitical strategy. He doesn't seem to be. He flies by the seat of his pants for the most cases, but he ramps up the danger globally right now. So I'm quite worried about the situation.
Qinduo, the United States says that the sanctions are directed more at Russia than at China. Do you buy that?
No. Look, my colleague talked about the possible waiver, to be applied to the Indian purchase of Russian weapons, probably to Turkey too. Look, those waivers, the rationale for those waivers is basically like, I understand you need to purchase some of the weapons from Russia, but you should reduce those your purchase from Russia, and you should expand your purchase of U.S. weapons to strengthen your defense capability. Look, if you look at the Chinese situation, so there's arms ban against China, so China cannot purchase advanced weapons from the U.S. nor from the European countries. So the only country basically China can purchase from is from Russia. So the U.S. says, now we are not targeting at your defense capabilities. I'm not sure the Chinese side will buy that. Right. And also, I share my colleagues' the concern, with the situation. It's not really about the sanctioning measures against China or the trade war between China and the U.S. You do see this trust between the two countries at the top level. You wonder the trust is being eroded now. There's no dialogue, no serious dialogue, serious engagement with each other. And the Chinese side would see, it's not about, if you look at the trade war, it's not about, narrowing the gap of the trade, deficit, but probably the U.S. is trying to drive all those investment out of China to cut off this supply chain, to beat China in the competition of trade, economic development here.
Yuval, as Peter said, we don't know whether this is some kind of broad, big strategy that's being formulated and developed by the United States, but what is the foreign policy objective here? What is the U.S. trying to achieve?
Well, this particular sanctions designation was probably the least harmful to Russia that could have been, because the people who are sanctioned are the ones who were indicted by Robert Mueller earlier. These people are all in Russia. They're not coming to the United States. No American is really going to do business with the FSB or GRU. So in effect, this particular sanctions bill was meant to deter the Deter Act, which is a far more aggressive sanctions bill against Russia. So in terms of what is the larger thing that we see here, it's about trying to maintain the pressure on Russia, but without making it that much worse. But in terms of what the administration has said that they're very interested in, it's about putting pressure on Iran. It's about coming to some sort of resolution or solution in Syria and in the wider Middle East. And so what we can interpret here is that the United States is trying to make sure that Iran doesn't increase its activities in Syria against its ally Israel. And that is probably, I would say, the most accurate way of interpreting this, is making sure that this doesn't become a much wider war in the Middle East, and the Chinese were basically the unlucky victims in this instance.
So is China, in this instance, what, sort of collateral damage in the
I think it's probably fair to say, in terms of probably the military or economic impact on this particular unit and on the Chinese military is fairly big, it's fairly strong. This is not going to make the difference. It's not after this particular sanctions bill that China will be unable to defend itself.
Right.
But the message is sent that the United States is looking towards the purchasers, the customers of Russian arms export, and it's not afraid to basically go after very large and powerful countries like China.